Good morning. I'm starting again. I recorded this once and apparently it didn't work very well. So I want to start by thanking the organizers for creating this stimulating panel and for proactively releasing me from making these comments live at 5:30 a.m. and also for their patience in my trying to get an actual video to them. Some sort of technical difficulties. It seems like that's the theme for the conference. So I may try to join in my pajamas at the end, but we'll see how that goes. All right. I also want to thank the panelists for a diverse and stimulating group of papers. And let's all give ourselves a pat on the back for pulling this off, assuming that it's pulled off, which hopefully it will be by the time I finish this. All right, so in pulling these papers together, I've got some fortunate framing of the organizers who suggest in their opening that we might ask two questions. First, what semiotic means do social actors use to presuppose and/or entail exclusion through style and stylization? And second, on which ideological assumptions are these choices perceived, rationalized, justified, and are contested as exclusionary? So following that, let's look at how all of these papers related to these questions, which are also, and not surprisingly, reflected in the panel title. So what is style, and what are the indexical and semiotic processes around it? Style here, in most of these papers, is used in the sense of Eckert, who argues that style is a particular configuration of resources such that the indexical meaning of any one component can be indexical of the style altogether. Importantly, styles are not free-floating conceptual sounds or other practices, but rather themselves are indexical of specific and registered personae, such as jocks, burnouts, gay divas, or visco girls, to take some American examples. Two things to note here. The first is the semiotic atoms, if you will, that build styles are not limited to linguistic practices at all, but can include embodied and multimodal practices. Second, the fact that style is embedded in the process of enregisterment almost entails that by creating a style, by doing it, noticing it, or enregistering it, there is exclusionary work going on. Although this is a question for discussion, to what extent is enregistering a style inherently exclusionary? So these papers show that different bits and strategies of style can become in different ways highlighted or spotlighted in interaction in order to do exclusionary work, and at times the actual doing of, indeed the very point of, the enregisterment of the persona is to include and exclude people in various ways, either by creating difference with another persona or to exclude certain people from a persona. So I'm going to do my best with names, but I haven't heard any of them before, so please excuse that. So Alexander and Dennis provide an exciting example of how technological affordances create opportunities for new stylistic choices that can promote exclusion even in the face of inclusionary goals. That is, the motive addressed, that is text, is a choice that is made with respect to a Lithuanian migrant, a choice which would not be made with a native Norwegian speaker. Another interesting aspect of this is to think about the ways that styles change based on addressee, something that is rarely addressed in work on style of this kind. This points to the inherently relational aspect of style. Who the style is perceived to be by the listening subject is important. So something that seems on the face of it a simple accommodation practice is much more complex and can be exclusionary. Turin also points to a different way that we might think of style and exclusion. In this case, it is official bodies and linguists doing language planning who are explicitly working to create a style or a language that is exclusive to a nationalism they want to ideologically reinforce. Moreover, the object of the style is how to represent a language in orthography, something that linguists tend to worry about much less than non-linguists and those non-linguists who use orthography and engage in text quite a lot. The orthographic segments become indexicals of nationalism, to some extent representing actual pronunciation differences, but it's clear these pronunciation differences are not as clear-cut as is represented for creating the orthography. I'd love to see more of the interaction of the bodies as they deliberated, and the discourse of how the arguments for each of the two spelling differences are argued. think on the fact that it is literally 3 orthographic characters, the space, the sh character, the je character, I think that's how they're pronounced, that this argument hinges on. These facts point to the ways in which issues of language policy and planning relate so closely with nationalism, more than nationism, just as, for example, adopting singular they in English is about more than grammar, and just as, for example, adopting singular they in English is about much more than grammar. Based on the abstract, I believe Nasenstein also expands the notion of style to do exclusionary work, and it's likely more like, and here it is more likely aligned with Eckert's work in Belton High. However, it's interesting that Eckert as well looks more at the personally agentive and aspirational uses of linguistic variables by speakers than ways in which those differentiate from others. Of course, in some ways, Labov was, in many other things, here first in his 1972 article, The Linguistic Consequences of Being a Lame. Saigye's paper is reminiscent of Inoue's work on the rise of Japanese women's language, in which said style was identified by the, quote, listening subjects, which in this case were old men, as part of the project of Japanese nationalism. In the Turkish case, elements of style are used to position speakers by taking negative evaluative stances to the outgroup, within a gender ideological framework, in which, I might add, men come off as particularly manipulable. Finally, and importantly, note the feminist perspective of this paper, echoing the central thesis of E. Kozovsky-Sedgwick's 1985 Between Men, which sees the described dynamic as a way that women buy into patriarchal view, and as Saigye points out, prevents the women from coming together in solidarity. Finally, Haid shows how proper names can be recruited in the work of typification, labeling a stylistic persona with an iconic proper noun. Note that one of Donald Trump's most powerful and oft-used strategies to gain interactional power was to use a name of his own choosing for someone. Naming is a very powerful move which denies the addressee the autonomy to name themselves. Haid's leases are in a similar situation and registering a particular set of stylistic and biographical circumstances. Moreover, the people identified as a Lisa, in all likelihood, would resist being claimed as a token of the particular type that the determiner invokes, as Haid astutely notes is related to their ideologies of travel. So overall, how do these indexical processes of exclusion work? We might turn to Galen Irvine's 2019 book Signs of Difference for an answer. They argue, among other things, that differentiation, which lays the groundwork for exclusion, exhibits processes of what they call rematization, the creation of an axis of differentiation, fractal recursivity, and erasure. We might then ask how the panel papers show how style works through these processes. Rematization, which Galen Irvine have also called iconization in their language ideology work, is essentially when the style is somehow connected to a purported quality of the styler. So leases are inherently shallow, or refugees are less chaste, as evident from their styles, which logically do not entail such qualities. Even in the Montenegrin example, we see this, as the orthography and its separateness is taken to be a quality of the language and the nation, which is itself taken to be an inherent division of people rather than an ideological construct. These qualities then form the axis of differentiation. Importantly, and I quote, the specific qualities presumed to be in contrast depends on the ideologies that the social actors bring to the scene of comparison. Fractal recursivity is something that they've used, that Galen Irvine have used in other work as well. And it really, that when they use it, it means that the axis of comparison can be repeated in some metaphorical way in different stylistic domains and scales. So in the Norwegian example, migrant status is relevant in media choice, word choice, emoticons, and punctuation, providing differentiation of similar types at different scales of interactional decision. And of course we have this in other papers as well, as large-scale ideologies of nationalism, gender, migration are recursively iconified in stylistic practice. On the other hand, Gall and Irvine also argue that erasure can come into play as ideological work becomes more invisible. This is especially noticeable in the Turkish example, in which assumptions about women and womanhood are erased while concerns of nationalism are put into focus. That is, there's no place for Iraqi Turkmen women in the Turkish women's ideologies to be both good wives and using makeup, and it is also found in the erasure of the label Iraqi Turkmen, which is used to moves to Syrian in this context. So Gall and Irvine's work, which is much more detailed and subtle than my application here, therefore shows how the processes of differentiation might be related to those of exclusion and the style and its indexicalities. Turning then to the ideological assumptions recruited to do the work, almost any social dimension, it seems, is relevant, but new dimensions can be created if they are needed to create some kind of exclusion. We see that most of these ideologies are ones that are in place to begin with, whether that is nationalism, nativism, migration status, and ideologies about age and political ideology. It seems that there's no ideology of exclusion or differentiation that, when relevant, language and style can't be invoked to support. Returning briefly to Gall and Irvine, they note that such differentiation brings this ideological domain in, quote, a focus of joint attention, unquote, and thereby raises its profile often to the status of something not to be challenged. Perhaps depressingly, it seems easier to do this exclusionary work vis-a-vis stylistic personae than it does to create mechanisms to include, although perhaps we can discuss in the remaining time how we might design systems or encourage systems to be more inclusionary without everyone being required to be the same. Thanks for listening. I look forward to your discussion.